Morena koutou katoa. My name is Jennifer and this is Dean, and today we are going to be reflecting on 35 years of Braided River conservation and research by Project River Recovery. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our project, it was established in 1990 in an agreement between the Department of Conservation and the ECNZ to compensate for the effects of the Upper Waitaki Hydro Scheme on braided rivers, lakes and wetlands in the region. I'll hand over to Dean, who's going to be talking about the first 7 years of the project, which really built the foundation for the remainder of the project.
Okay, the first 7 years were really about research and trying to understand a whole lot of things about this big task that was taken on. There was a lot of research about improving habitat for wildlife, particularly kaki, which in those days were at still very low numbers. During those 7 years, 46 scientific papers were produced, and a lot of those were done by students or other people from allied organisations. So there was this real strong emphasis on research. One of the big things was starting to look at weeds in those riverbeds, and we've already talked a little bit about managing rivers. In the early days, all of those braided rivers up there were pretty wild and dynamic, and over time, and you look at this photo, this is the Ahuriri looking up towards Killamont above the main road bridge. There's not a willow to be seen in there, whereas now a lot of those rivers are absolutely choked with willows. And when I arrived in the basin 20 odd years ago, ECAN, dare I say it, were busy planting willows furiously in some of those riverbeds. So yeah, our emphasis has been about trying to protect some of those habitats, those braided river habitats. So in the early days, the lower delta areas were starting to get choked out. This is the Takapo River. The Ahuriri was similar, so there was a lot of work done to try and control willows in those lower areas. There was also an emphasis on looking to see whether we could create wetlands and manage them for bird habitat. So the Ruataniwha wetlands were started to be created in 1993, and that was based along a series of springs that come out of the terraces on the Oho River with a series of drop log weirs so we could manage the levels. And the levels were managed to allow grass and stuff to grow during the winter months, and then or the autumn and early winter months, and then the ponds were raised to kill off that grass and then lowered to allow feeding for our native species. And in those early days, a number of black-fronted terns used to nest in that site. Project River Recovery, or PRR, was also involved with protecting mixed lagoon and mailbox, so they're also controlled sites. They also have weirs, and Forest and Bird were involved in funding fencing around those, so the old style electric fence with outriggers to try and keep predators out, which we all know now don't particularly work that well. But the focus for those sites was kaki habitat, so kaki feeding and nesting habitat. There was a lot of emphasis on trying to understand the impacts of mammalian predators, and the early days using technology, which at the time was state of the art. But looking at that, there's infrared video cameras chewed through the power, and these poor PRR workers had to carry huge big 12-volt batteries way out into the riverbeds, literally on a daily basis to keep the system going. But we actually learnt a lot of stuff from it. And one of the things that I highlighted obviously were cats were, just so had that ability to take all life stages, so eggs, chicks and adults. But the other thing that we learnt during that process was the impact of hedgehogs, which probably up until that point were considered a fairly benign little creature that snuffled around and ate a few snails. But in fact, they are quite a significant predator of particularly eggs and also chicks of braided river birds. There was a whole lot of other research that was done during that first period. And one of the ones that I wanted to just touch on was the fact that you note there were feral cat toxin trials back then, and we're still trying to come up with a really good toxin in a sausage form using pap to target cats. So in a way that we can broadcast baits relatively easily and straightforward. And the other big thing is that, the whole predator-free strategy doesn't mention cats at the moment. And it's something that's starting to get talked about a wee bit more. Feral cats are probably, one of our number one predators. So, yeah, there was a whole raft of research, and of course, RHD was coming onto the scene, so there was research on that as well. Since those first 7 years, we've continued on a 7-year cycle. So we've used a more formal strategic plan on a 7-year approach. And there's been 5 basic key objectives in each of those plans, and we'll just run through those. So the first one was controlling impacts of weeds, which followed on from that early stuff around willows. And the emphasis has been on those upper braided rivers above the lakes, above the glacial lakes, because they were still relatively pristine. And for some of them, the emphasis has been on controlling lupins, which were introduced into the basin because they created a splash of colour in this drab Mackenzie landscape. And unfortunately, as we all know, they have incredibly long seed survival in gravel, and they're just an ongoing problem. We spend thousands of dollars every year, particularly in places like the Tasman. The other thing that PRO has done is tried to keep particular weeds out of the basin that weren't there in large numbers, and anything new that's coming in. And false tamarisk is one that's turned up in about the last 5 or 6 years. So we're really trying to ensure that we keep that out, because we know that's a big problem in some of those lower rivers. So we're starting to use new technology. So the use of spray drones. It's not going to take over everything we do, because we're still using ground crews and helicopter spraying at times. But examples of this is on our black-fronted tern colony at Tern Island. We try and control the weeds there so they have nice clean gravel to nest on. So being able to do a grid spray of Tern Island just makes it a hell of a lot easier than have the ground crews having to drag hoses and things across the river channels. The other shot is in the Godley, where some of our khaki staff had reported false tamarisk sites, so we were able to feed those into the drone and get it to do a grid search of that whole area, and just spray what they found. So they found half a dozen false tamarisk plants and a couple of gorse and willow plants. So it's mixing different styles of control, but using the new technology where we can. Ruataniwha wetlands, as I said, in the early days was managed for its bird values, but over time they've tended to stop using it. So we still manipulate the water levels for the ephemeral plant habitat that it creates. And we've got a number of rare and threatened plants that exist in that area. And Mixed Lagoon and Mailbox Inlet, as I said, they had electric fences, but that style of predator control fences is really is old school. It's really, really hard to maintain, the electric fences in any sort of semblance of working order. So they're no longer maintained, but they still have value as khaki feeding and nesting sites. And we also have gone back to releasing some of our khaki chicks there.
So another one of our objectives is to test various designs of mammalian predator control. And so one of our designs has been this ring of steel trapping network that we've established in the Upper Waitaki River. So it's essentially a 1 kilometre radius trapping network around an island in the river where a large colony of black-fronted terns nests every year. So we ran that design for about 6 years before moving into another phase, which reduced it down to a 500-metre radius to understand the trade-offs at running it at kind of a lower cost to the 1 kilometre radius. We've run that for 6 years, and we've kind of made a few adaptations in recent times, bringing in new tools like predator detection dogs and changing the timing of our bait deployment and things.
I was just going to say the other high-tech thing we used there was following a talk, I think it was last year, that John Innes did about Norway rats and the fact that they use scent trails. So our guys went out and tied dead rats to their shoes and dragged them around to try and create scent trails to lead them into traps. So Norway rats are something that have become more problematic in the last few years, and they obviously like existing around those islands and waterways, and trying to get on top of those has been a challenge. At the other end of the scale, when I first arrived, we were setting up the Tasman project, which was a large-scale catchment style of predator control. Obviously, trap spacing is a lot wider, and when we set out to do it, we always acknowledged that we'd never get on top of some of those species, particularly hedgehogs, because we knew their home ranges were just too small. So that's been run in collaboration with the Kaki Recovery Project, and also more latterly TMA or Te Manahuna Aoraki for extending some of those trap lines. But that was designed to try and increase breeding success in our braided river birds over that 20,000 hectares. And by and large, it's been relatively successful. Technology, so trail cams as opposed to those wonderful, or that wonderful setup you saw earlier on. The ability to put a whole lot of trail cams out on our nesting colonies and see what's going on. And one of the things that we picked up on, particularly around breeding success of black-fronted terns, we were just having regular failures. Either it was flooding or we'd have total colony desertion. And we started to see that black-backed gulls were actually a significant predator. So that was when we started controlling black-backed gulls. And we've used various techniques for that. Started with alpha chlorelase and moved into shooting and aerial control. Ironically, in those early days in the Tasman, we saw very few black-billed gulls, and since we started controlling blackbacks, then their numbers increased. But now we're actually seeing that from time to time, black-billed gulls will also predate on black-fronted tern eggs and chicks. That's a bit more problematic. The other thing about the Tasman, and this really accentuated that, rabbit populations drive our predators, not the other way around. And in 2021, we were served notice that rabbit numbers were too high in the Tasman, so we were able to get LINZ to fund a 1080 operation in the riverbed itself, and also to fund rabbit netting the fence that runs all the way down the road to Aoraki. And then in 2023, there was a Pindone operation a bit further up, so around Aoraki Airport and what we call the Tasman Flats. What has happened since then with continued night shooting is we've been actually, because we're not getting immigration from other land, we've been able to keep rabbit numbers to a relatively low level. And what we're seeing is two things. One is, and at the moment it's only had a year or so to play out, but we're seeing less cat numbers. So we do a leg holding period in late autumn, and that's kind of designed to target trap shy cats. So the last 2 years in particular, but more so this year, we've had significantly less cats caught in those leg holds. And we're actually seeing less cats caught in our kill traps as well. So we're kind of hoping that if we can keep rabbit numbers lower, then maybe we'll have less predators to deal with in the long term. But the other thing that we've seen is that we've had this really spectacular recovery of vegetation, particularly around the cushion plant communities, Carmichaelia species. This used to be like just a wasteland out there when rabbit numbers were really high, full of burrows and just a mess. So that's been a really spectacular result of keeping rabbit numbers low.
Yeah, so Dean already mentioned that we've seen quite good results for the birds from our trapping networks, but it's not just the birds that we've been tracking in these two designs, we've also been tracking other species of lizards and invertebrates to understand how the trapping networks benefit a range of different species and taxa.
So the fourth one was around developing better knowledge of our braided river species.
Yeah, so we've also done quite a lot of work in the project to understand the distribution and diversity of the vegetation and invertebrates we find in these braided rivers. So Chris Wilmore did quite a lot of work in the Upper Waitaki Basin with the vegetation, identifying the different communities that are present and the species that are key to those various communities. That was then followed up by a study on the invertebrates by Sue Anderson and Tara Murray in just one of those vegetation communities, the cushion fields. And they found an incredible amount of invertebrate diversity, over 900 taxonomic units. And so it just goes to show that these apparently barren-looking landscapes can actually hold an immense amount of diversity, which is really important. The awesome thing about having a long-term project, 35 years, is that we can also gather some really long-term data on the trends of these species in our braided rivers. So we've been running braided river bird surveys in 11 braided rivers in the basin since the early 1990s when the project was established. So we were able to have really long-term data. We've also looked at the trends of other species, such as robust grasshopper and Maniatoto peppercrest as well, which occurs on the braided river terraces. More recently, we've been supporting the work of Katie Gray, who has put solar-powered GPS transmitters onto black-fronted terns and banded dotterels to understand more about how they're moving through the catchment, both during the breeding season when they're there, but also in the off-season. And this has really highlighted where critical breeding grounds are within the basin, but also that not all the black-fronted terns are roosting overnight where their nesting colony is, and that a lot of them are moving to the deltas at nighttime. And it's been really interesting to kind of reveal the movements of these species, which has often been a bit mysterious before this new technology came around.
And PRR has picked up management and monitoring of some of our threatened native fish. We've got 10 trout barriers installed in various spots in the basin and the Hakatara Mere. Trout and introduced macrophytes are problematic for these species. We do annual monitoring to ensure that sites are kept trout free and just to monitor population levels. And the use of eDNA has been a new tool that's made that sort of detection of problem species a lot easier with a lot less labour. This is what you hope to see in a site where you've got rid of trout. So this is juvenile big nose from behind a barrier in Fork Stream. And lastly, one of the big things that PRR has done is advocacy for our braided rivers and wetlands.
So ever since the project began, we've been supporting education and advocacy of braided rivers. So it's an example of some of the signs and pamphlets that were created in the early 1990s, and then their kind of modern day version that we have around now. But another really important part of the project has been connecting with students of various ages and showing them the values that can be found in the braided rivers and some of the tools that can be used to protect these species. And it's really rewarding seeing some of those students then go on to do research projects and end up working in the braided river space as well.
So in 2015, we got Neville Pete to write a book on the first 25 years of PRR. It didn't become a bestseller, I must admit, but we utilise it as a advocacy tool, and hand it out to management and ministers of conservation, etc. Try and get the message across. We've also won a number of awards over the years for our work, and the most recent was the Cawthron New Zealand River Award in 2019 for the work that has happened in the Tasman, the protection and restoration work there. Finally, 35 years, there's a hell of a lot of staff and students and contractors and collaborators that have helped us through this journey. And we just like to acknowledge all of those, as far too many to name. But yeah, thanks very much.
Any questions?
The way they do it is they send a little drone out, and they're using AI, so they have the ability to identify weed species. So they often send a little drone out to identify where the particular species are, come back, that feeds the information into the big drone, which has a 40-litre tank, and away it goes, and it just sprays the particular problem species and avoids the natives. Well, see, the Oho River is a controlled river, and so it doesn't have a lot of flooding down it, but it has channels on both sides of the island, obviously. What we're talking about doing, because Fish and Game are doing some work around trout spawning enhancement sites, and one of those is really close to Turn Island, and what we've talked about as part of their consent that we might do a wee bit of modification to even up the flows around both sides, because at the moment one side has got a lot more water going down it than the other. So there is a bit of discussion around trying to improve flows down both sides. Cool.
Thank you so much.
Okay.